Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger of the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our weekly international webcast featuring our founder and president, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Today is May 9th, which is celebrated in many countries, including Russia and Israel, as Victory Day to commemorate the end of the fighting in World War II in Europe. We hope that as you join us in commemorating this day, you reflect on both the horrors of war, but also that you redouble your commitment to work with the Schiller Institute to find peaceful solutions to the crises in the world today. And we have some new unfolding crises, starting with the presentation or the speech last night by President Trump, in which he announced that the United States he's taking the United States out of the Iran agreement. And Helga, this is quite a significant event. But we don't know the full implications. What does it mean, and what are the reactions to it so far?
Well, I think there is a general concern voiced by many countries and forces, for example, China, Russia, but also Merkel, Macron, May, they all expressed concern that this is potentially a very dangerous development because it could easily spin out of control. Now, obviously, it's a quite complicated situation because President Rouhani said that if the other participants in the agreement, China, Russia, France, Germany, and Great Britain, will stick with it, that Iran will comply and continue with the agreement. But that may turn out to be difficult. First of all, because the internal situation in Iran is not so easy. The hardliners already said that they will abandon the treaty, like the Speaker of the Parliament, Larijani, said that. Other hardliners were already shouting death to America. So that looks complicated and dangerous. Then naturally, the threat by the new American ambassador in Berlin, who was just for one day in his post, immediately put out a tweet saying German firms should pull out of Iran immediately, which naturally was not met with enthusiasm. Wolfgang Ischinger basically gave him a very diplomatic advice, saying that he should represent the interest of his country, but not tell the guest country what to do. And there were even commentaries in such papers as Spiegel Online, which said that this whole behavior of Trump to unilaterally cancel such a treaty is shaking the very foundations of the Western alliance. Now, if it all remains to be seen, Trump said that he wants to get rid of this deal because it's a very bad deal, and that he has another one, but unfortunately, he has not yet given any indication what that plan would be. Now, if you look at the situation, the danger, obviously, and this is something which Global Times and also the VIPs, the Veterans of Intelligence for Sanity, these are the retired intelligence people from the United States, they all warn that naturally, if now that would mean that Iran goes back to its nuclear program, then this could immediately trigger a spiral of such competition and arms race where Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, they all could start or wanted to start a nuclear program on their own. Naturally, there is a big concern, how will this affect the present ongoing preparations for the summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. So it has all of these things. Naturally, the reactions from the military are quite different. Both the majority of the military in the United States, but also in Israel, are not of the opinion of Netanyahu, and unfortunately, Trump, made this view his own. For example, General Mattis, General Dunford, in the United States all had said that Iran was complying with this agreement. Also, some of the Israeli defense establishment said the same thing. So on the other side, Netanyahu has some cabinet ministers who are quite wild and, who commented on the election victory or winning of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, that if President Assad of Syria would not kick out Iran altogether from Syria, they would liquidate Assad. So this is a bellicose language. And while Trump was speaking, canceling his US participation in the Iranian deal, a new airstrike was launched, hitting an area nearby Damascus, for which nobody has claimed responsibility yet. But, the likelihood that it could have been from Israel is very high, since they launched a previous attack. Now, that means a very dangerous and very messy situation. And I think that, if President Trump says he has an alternative plan, well, then it should involve a couple of things to work. First of all, any peace plan or any security architecture has to take into account the security interest of all participating countries. And one of the reasons why Iran in the first place was so adamant to develop its own nuclear weapons was not only obviously what happened with Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, but also the fact, which nobody speaks about, but which is a known public secret, the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons. So any agreement must include a security guarantee also for Iran for it to work. Now, obviously, given the condition of the entire Middle East after the destructive wars in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, it is very clear that the only thing which will really solve the problems of this region would be what I have said many times before. You need the extension of the new Silk Road into the entire region, from Afghanistan to the Mediterranean, from the Caucasus to the Gulf, and basically have a development plan for all of these countries as an integrated one. And this obviously could only work if Russia, China, India, Iran, Egypt, the United States, and hopefully European countries are all agreeing that this region must be economically built up. And the only way you can have peace in the region and really get rid of terrorism is if you have a perspective for the hope for the future. So I would really hope that if President Trump says he has an alternative plan, a more comprehensive plan, then it should absolutely include joint ventures, of the United States, Russia, China, India, in the development of this region. And a beginning was made between President Xi Jinping and Modi when they met in Wuhan a week ago, where India and China said they would start joint development projects in Afghanistan, building a railroad from Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Iran, China, and that would be of many other projects to follow. You need a comprehensive economic development plan for it to work. And, so I would really hope that President Trump would think in this direction, because I think that's the only way it could be stabilized.
Well, let me just probe a couple of areas of things you just brought up, because there's some things that are really quite significant. You talked about the effect of sanctions. The effort to use sanctions as, in a sense, almost an act of war doesn't only affect the country that's being sanctioned. We've seen with the congressional sanctions against Russia, the so-called CAATSA agreement, that this is having profound implications for Germany, especially with gas and pipelines. And now this latest agreement with the threat, as you mentioned, the U.S. ambassador to Germany threatening German firms. Is there a reaction that coming from Europe and especially from Germany on this?
Well, I know that German industry is demanding from the German government and the EU to protect them, because if you would have a situation where the sanctions against Iran are declared and would also hit German and European firms which are doing business in Iran. I mean, on top of the Russian sanctions, I mean, this is getting too much. This is, I think, why some of these commentators are saying this is shaking the very foundations of the Western alliance, because just recently, a couple of days ago, the Eastern Division of the German industry put out a statement, an appeal to the German government and the EU by saying that the recent round of sanctions against the Russian oligarchs and firms is already costing the German industry several hundred million euro in direct losses, but much, much more in indirect losses. And this is really getting to the substance of many firms who are threatened. Entire production lines are threatened. Now, if you take the danger of German firms or European firms being hit by the Iranian sanctions, there is a limit to what is bearable in terms of the national interest of Germany if you don't want to. And I think there is a reaction. I think it's not a good thing because I mean this is not the way to conduct policy. I think Iran must be integrated into a security architecture. If you isolate a country, if you demonize it, and if you take the one-sided view of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and now unfortunately President Trump, I mean, this has the prescription for disaster. So I think sanctions are not functioning. You see it in the case of Russia, that contrary to what the expectation was, Russia will never change its position on the Crimea, because the narrative of the Crimea is not the way the West is putting it. It is quite a different dynamic. It started all with the policy of regime change. You have to look at the policy for a new American century, the role of Victoria Nuland, the EU association agreement. You have to look at many factors looking at the Crimea. Did Putin change his policy? No. Did it lead to a regime change? No. Putin was just re-elected with a very vast majority, and sanctions are just not an adequate measure to conduct policy. The only way how in this period you can solve any problem is through diplomacy and negotiation, and that is the only way. Any other way, coups, military strikes, regime change, color revolution, all of these are just different degrees of warfare which can have no good result at all.
Well, that brings us to the obvious question. We know the Saudis and the Israelis wanted this decision from President Trump, but ultimately, who benefits from these sanctions, these proxy wars, and the overall increase in tension in the world? Who's benefiting from this?
Well, the only ones who benefit are those who believe in geopolitics, divide and conquer, that you always have to ally with the weaker against the stronger. You have to, and the British Empire is very famous of having conducted this policy. And, I mean, in this case, Netanyahu claimed that Iran violated the treaty, but, this was not confirmed by the International Atomic Energy Agency. It was rejected by various UN institutions. So where does this come from? Even Netanyahu had to backtrack and basically rehashed old accusations going back to the Bush administration. And, in a certain sense, you can say that the same kind of destabilization, which was reflected in the Trump Gate, which now turns out to be collusion, not with Russia, but with the former heads of intelligence of the Obama administration, with the British government. Then the Skripal case came from the same origin. Then the so-called chemical weapon attack from Syria was a continuation of the same effort. And now you can say that Netanyahu basically acted as an instrument of the same interest. And this is very dangerous, and it's very, very unfortunate that President Trump again and again has been affected by these forces, obviously around him. And I can only say, there must be a complete change in the attitude, because geopolitics is the stuff of which 2 world wars were made. And given the fact that we have the 9th of May today, we should really make a solemn commitment. Never again. We cannot have world wars again. And this kind of destabilization has the potential of spinning out of control. If there would be a military conflict between Israel and Iran, which is not to be excluded at this point, it could spin out of control and lead to the extinction of civilization. So this is not stuff to be played with.
Well, we see something similar also in the reaction to President Putin's inauguration address, where he made a very strong commitment to serve his term to improve the conditions of the Russian people, with an emphasis on science, technology, industry, longer living standard or higher living standards, more longevity. And yet you look at the Western press and it's nothing but an attack on Putin as the new czar. So we see the same kind of hysteria over that. What were your thoughts on, by the way, also President Trump did congratulate Putin on his inauguration. Do you have any thoughts on what's happening with the inauguration and also the Victory Day celebration in Moscow today?
Well, I think that, President Putin has a perspective for the next 6 years. He has a very ambitious program to improve the living standard, the longevity, the pensions, and various other aspects for the Russian people. So I think, there is one reality in Russia. We have to see who exactly is appointed in the cabinet and who gets what position, and if there is a continuation of the liberal policies which were unfortunately also there in the past. But I think the difference between the Western cynical, totally almost hysterical reactions to the way the Chinese responded to the new period of office in office of Putin. For example, Global Times had a quite correct observation by saying they do not expect that the relationship between Russia and the West will improve easily or anytime soon, simply because the West does not reconcile the fact that Russia has a new power status in the world as a global player, as a country with a vast territory and incredibly vast resources. Now, I remember very well that many years ago, Madeleine Albright and also Joschka Fischer, the Greenie foreign minister of Germany at the time, or it was after his office, I think, they said that Russia simply has too many raw materials to allow that Russia is the only one which has access and use of these raw materials. And I think this is really the deeper underlying reason why certain people in the West are so completely freaked out that Putin, with very difficult circumstances, was able to undo what was done to Russia in the Yeltsin period, where the demographic curve collapsed by 1 million a year, and Putin has restarted the Russian economy to a very large extent. He has consolidated the strategic partnership with China, and he has, despite obvious economic difficulties, not at least resulting out of the economic sanctions and various other problems, has been able to outflank the military containment of Russia by announcing 4 new weapon systems on March 1st, which basically make the American anti-ballistic missile system obsolete. So I think, while, Putin himself said that, there will be a period of great challenges But I think in general, the Putin has managed to do quite an enormous job, and all the demonization against him is because he did that. I mean, Russia was supposed to go the way Yeltsin set the record, submit to the West, to liberal policies, to shock therapy. But now, basically, Russia has reassumed its status as a world power. And, that is obviously to the chagrin of the geopoliticians in the West. But I don't think it will help them any.
Well, we see the geopoliticians in the West screaming about China also. But as you pointed out in the last couple of days, there's been a tremendous advance in the diplomatic policies in Asia. We had the follow-up meeting of North Korean President Kim with Xi of China, and also these announcements of North Korea being brought into the Belt and Road Initiative following the Kim meeting with President Moon of South Korea. So this is all very promising. What can you tell us about these developments?
Well, I think, hopefully the cancellation of the Iran deal will not affect this, which I'm quite worried about. But when Kim Jong-un and Moon in met, President Moon gave his North Korean counterpart some drive. And on that, there was a whole development plan for North Korea. And this involves 3 economic corridors, railway lines connecting all the way from South Korea through North Korea to China and to the Trans-Siberian Railway. And there is now a big discussion in Moscow in particular about the Tumen River project. Now, this is fantastic because, this is an economic development plan which involves Russia, China, and North Korea. And it would make this region, which is now very little developed, into one of the big transport hubs for all of Asia. So, if this program goes ahead well, and, the fact that Pompeo was again just in North Korea preparing the summit between Trump and Kim means, as of now, it's still on a very good track. That if these development projects would be implemented, you could have a complete economic miracle between the 2 Koreas, and this could, really make the way for a peaceful unification and integration into the Belt and Road Initiative, and transform this area of the world from a crisis spot into one of the most prosperous regions. Now, for me, this development shows that if there is a goodwill on the side of the political leaders, you can take any crisis, and solve it exactly the way this was solved, with back-channel discussions involving Russia, China, and the United States. And it is an example that with goodwill, you can turn the worst crisis into the opposite and make it a hopeful perspective. So one would really hope that this lesson is being learned, and that same method is being applied to the Middle East right now, using the fact that the new Silk Road is already the most dynamic development on the planet, that all the people can be brought to see the benefit of cooperating and joining into this development.
Well, on that latter point you just mentioned, there's some new figures that were just released that show the point that you've been making about the US-China trade deficit, that in fact, as the Silk Road project grows, China is also importing more. And these figures show that a massive increase in trade, and especially China importing almost as much as it's exporting. So perhaps this lesson will be learned by people in the United States. Also, Helga, I just wonder if you have some thoughts on the meetings that are taking place now between China, South Korea, and Japan, because that's another part of this whole picture.
Yeah, I think it's also today that you have the summit between these 3 countries. And, that is also obviously extremely important, given the recent strategic realignment of Japan, where Prime Minister Abe is now openly cooperating with the Belt and Road Initiative. And obviously, South Korea has offered to mediate between North Korea and Japan, because Kim Jong-un has expressed the wish to also have a summit with Prime Minister Abe. So I think all of this is really hopeful and going in the right direction. And just to mention this Belt and Road figures, the Chinese government put out statistics about the year 2017, which completely show that all this propaganda about how these countries are all going into a debt trap is completely ridiculous, because the total volume of the trade between China and 71 countries of the Belt and Road Initiative was 1.5 trillion in 2017. And about 666 billion were imports of China from these countries. The exports of China were something like 750 billion, but the increase of the import grew much faster, namely by 20%, and the exports only grew by 8.5%. So it's almost a balanced trade picture, and it shows that rather the line that China is just exerting its influence to the disadvantage of the participating countries is absolutely not true. These countries get absolutely economically invigorated. They export to many other countries, but also to China. So I think this is a complete success story. And that is really where the growth of the world is taking place.
Well, instead of reflecting that, most of the discussion in the West is this discussion about the so-called China debt bubble, the Belt and Road debt bubble, when in fact it's the debt bubble in the West which threatens the world economy. And I know you looked at the new book by Nomi Prince on this. There's a lot more material coming out, but don't you think it's, obviously you did, that it's ironic that the people who scream about China's debt, when that is debt as credit going into real physical production, have nothing to say about the unsustainable volume of debt that continues to grow in the West? I mean, this is highly incongruous, isn't it?
Well, I think it's not only incongruous, but it's also reckless, because there are dangers, like the Middle East situation spinning out of control, or other such security dangers. But one big danger, the second major danger, is obviously an uncontrolled blowout of the system. And what Nomi Price on her book tour emphasized again and again, that all the parameters of the financial crisis are 40% worse than 2008. And the book, by the way, has the name Collusion: How the Central Banks Rigged the Markets. So it's a quite different form of collusion. And obviously, this is the unspoken danger, and the only way how that danger can be eliminated is you have to have the full package, which was designed by my husband a couple of years ago. You need Glass-Steagall in the tradition of Roosevelt. You need Hamiltonian banking, a national bank. You need a credit system, and you need especially a crash program in an increase in the productivity of the economy, given the absolute collapse of productivity of Western economies due to either opium addiction, desperation, depression, or greedy ideology, or just monetarist policies. So the Western economies, while you have some bright spots here and there, need urgently a boost. And the only way you can have such a boost of productivity is you have to have a qualitative higher level of energy flux density in the production process, and leading to a crash program for the development of thermonuclear fusion and international cooperation in space technology. And that way you would reinvigorate and innovate the entire economy. And then naturally you have to have a completely new paradigm in the relations among nations working together in the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road, joint ventures in third countries, development of the Middle East together, development of Africa, Latin America. I think people have to really fight for the future to not stay in the prejudices of the old paradigm. Because if we do that, I don't think the chances of mankind to make it are very big. On the other side, if there would be such a program where President Trump, for example, would stick to his election promises, he made many times afterwards in rallies, to implement Glass-Steagall, to go back to the American system of economy, which, by the way, is much, much closer to the Chinese model than people realize, because it is based on, state intervention, on, that certain areas of the economy are the task of the state and not of private industry. So it's no coincidence that Benjamin Franklin was a follower of Confucius. Sun Yat-sen was inspired by the American system. I mean, there are many, many, parallels and connections which would actually make the cooperation very easy. But obviously, Wall Street is totally dead set against it, and the City of London naturally in the same way, if not more, if that's possible. So therefore, we need an international mobilization to implement Glass-Steagall before the crash comes. Because if the crash comes without such re-regulation and getting rid of the speculative bubble, the danger is a plunge into chaos. And that would be, with almost certainty, also a leverage to a war. So I would urge you, join the Schiller Institute, help us in this mobilization, and help us in particular to make the alternative of the new Silk Road as a new paradigm more known. Because once people know, they get completely different idea. And, there is absolutely the solution available, but it needs people who are mobilizing for it, because it doesn't come on its own.
I think that's a fitting way to close our discussion on this Victory Day. And I think it's important to note that one can learn the lessons of the past, but it requires critical thinking. And people can go to the Schiller Institute website and find numerous articles written by Helga or presentations she's given on the lessons of the 20th century and the danger of sleepwalking into a new world war. So Helga, on this Victory Day, I thank you for reiterating these points. And again, you can go to our website and become a member of the Schiller Institute, because we are the one force in the world that's absolutely clear on these issues. So thank you for joining us. And Helga, thanks for being with us today.